"You'll never unlock this Egyptian tomb," Dr. Marcus Whitfield sneered, his voice dripping with contempt as he gestured toward the ancient granite entrance. 3,000 years and the greatest minds in archaeology have failed. What makes you think a simple janitor could succeed where scholars have fallen short? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The scorching Egyptian sun beat down mercilessly on the excavation site near Saqqara, casting long shadows across the desert sand. The dig site buzzed with activity as archaeologists, graduate students, and workers moved about their tasks, but all eyes had turned toward the confrontation unfolding near the mysterious sealed tomb that had puzzled experts for decades. Khalil Hassan stood quietly beside his cleaning cart, his weathered hands gripping the handle as he endured the public humiliation. At 68 years old, he had worked at various archaeological sites across Egypt for over 30 years, invisible to most of the foreign experts who came and went like desert winds. His simple galabiya was dusty from the morning's work, and his kind eyes remained fixed on the hieroglyphic inscriptions that covered the tomb's entrance. Dr. Whitfield was in his element, surrounded by his team of international researchers and wealthy donors who had funded this latest expedition. The British archaeologist had built his reputation on high-profile discoveries and best-selling books that painted him as a modern-day Howard Carter. His perfectly pressed khaki shirt and expensive field boots marked him as someone who viewed archaeology more as a glamorous adventure than genuine scholarly pursuit. The tomb in question had been discovered 6 months earlier during routine survey work. What made it extraordinary wasn't its size or obvious wealth, but rather the complete absence of any traditional opening mechanisms. Unlike other Egyptian tombs that featured hidden switches, counterweights, or removable stones, this burial chamber appeared to be sealed by methods that defied conventional understanding. The entrance was covered in hieroglyphs so complex and layered that even the most experienced translators struggled to decipher their meaning. "Listen carefully, Hassan. Drive." She shifted uncomfortably as she watched Khalil endure the public mockery, knowing from her research that local knowledge often contained kernels of truth that academic training missed. "But please, Hassan," Dr. Whitfield continued with theatrical flair, "enlighten us with your vast expertise. Tell us how you plan to accomplish what teams of scholars with decades of training have failed to achieve." His words drew more laughter from the donors, who seemed to view the entire exchange as entertainment rather than the humiliation of a fellow human being. Khalil finally spoke, his voice soft but clear in the desert air. "The symbols tell a story, Dr. Whitfield. Not just instructions, but a conversation between the living and the dead. You read them as if they were a manual, but they are poetry. They require understanding of the heart, not just the mind." This response only fueled Dr. Whitfield's amusement. "Poetry. Did you hear that, everyone? Our janitor believes tomb opening requires artistic interpretation rather than scientific methodology." The mockery in his voice was unmistakable, and several of the graduate students looked away, embarrassed by their mentor's behavior. What Dr. Whitfield didn't know, what none of the foreigners had bothered to learn during their time in Egypt, was that Khalil Hassan was far more than a simple maintenance worker. Born in a small village near Luxor, he was the last keeper of an oral tradition that stretched back over 3 millennia. His family had been guardians of ancient knowledge, storytellers who preserved the old ways when written records were destroyed or lost to time. The tradition had been passed down from father to son for generations, each keeper memorizing not just stories and legends, but practical knowledge about ancient construction techniques, symbolic meanings that had evolved over centuries, and most importantly, the spiritual beliefs that guided how the ancients interacted with their tombs and temples. Khalil's grandfather had been the village's master storyteller, a man revered for his ability to bring the distant past to life through words. When Khalil was young, he had shown exceptional memory and intuitive understanding of the old stories. His grandfather had chosen him as the next keeper, spending years teaching him the traditional methods of preserving and passing on ancient knowledge. But political upheaval and economic necessity had forced Khalil to leave his village and seek work in the growing tourism industry, where his knowledge of archaeological sites made him valuable as a guide and later as a maintenance worker. For 30 years, he had watched foreign archaeologists arrive with their theories and equipment, making discoveries that his family's oral traditions had already recorded centuries earlier. He had seen tombs opened using methods that damaged their contents, had witnessed artifacts removed without understanding their true significance, had observed scholars publish papers based on interpretations that missed the deeper spiritual and cultural context of what they studied. Through it all, Khalil had remained silent, understanding that his traditional knowledge was viewed as superstition by the academic community. He had learned to be invisible, to clean and maintain while the experts worked, occasionally offering subtle guidance when he saw them struggling with problems that his grandfather's stories had already solved. "Very well then," Dr. Whitfield announced with exaggerated formality. "I'll make you a proposition, Hassan. If you can open this tomb by sunset tomorrow, I'll personally fund your family's needs for the next year. That's more money than you'll see in a lifetime of pushing a mop around archaeological sites." The offer hung in the air like desert heat, shimmering with possibility and mockery in equal measure. Dr. Whitfield's donors murmured appreciatively at what they saw as generous sportsman's behavior, not recognizing the underlying cruelty of treating a human being's dignity as entertainment. Khalil's weathered face remained impassive, but inside, emotions churned like sandstorms. The money would indeed transform his family's circumstances. His grandson needed surgery that they couldn't afford. His daughter struggled to keep her small shop running while caring for her sick husband. And his own modest savings had been depleted by medical expenses and the rising cost of living in modern Egypt. But more than the financial incentive, something deeper called to him. The tomb itself seemed to whisper to his consciousness, its ancient symbols triggering memories of his grandfather's most sacred stories. This wasn't just another burial chamber to be catalogued and studied. According to the oral traditions passed down through his family, this was the resting place of Amenemheb, a priest scribe who had served during the turbulent period when the Old Kingdom collapsed and new ways of thinking emerged. The stories told of Amenemheb as a bridge figure, someone who understood both the ancient spiritual traditions and the newer political realities that were reshaping Egypt. He had been tasked with preserving the most sacred knowledge during a time of great upheaval, and his tomb had been designed not just as a resting place, but as a test for future generations who might prove worthy of accessing that preserved wisdom. "I accept your challenge, Dr. Whitfield," Khalil said quietly, his words carrying across the suddenly silent dig site. "But I ask for one condition. If I succeed, you will listen when I explain how the opening was accomplished. You will record my words accurately and include them in your official reports." Dr. Whitfield's eyebrows rose in surprise. He had expected either refusal or simple acceptance, not a counterproposal that suggested the janitor actually believed he could succeed. "Agreed," he said after a moment, his tone suggesting he viewed this as an easy concession since failure was inevitable. "When you fail tomorrow evening, you can return to your cleaning duties with this lesson in humility well learned." As the crowd began to disperse, Dr. Sarah Chen approached Khalil quietly. Unlike her colleagues, she had spent time studying the oral traditions that survived in Egyptian villages, and she recognized something in the older man's demeanor that suggested hidden depths. "Mr. Hassan," she said respectfully, "may I ask what you see in these hieroglyphs that others have missed?" Khalil studied the young woman's face, noting the genuine curiosity rather than condescension in her expression. "Dr. Chen, you have studied the written records, yes? The papyri and stone inscriptions that archaeologists catalog and translate?" She nodded. "Yes, it's been my primary focus for the past 5 years. But have you studied the stories that were never written down? The knowledge that was considered too sacred or too dangerous to commit to stone or papyrus?" Khalil's question opened a door to a world that formal education rarely acknowledged. Dr. Chen felt a flutter of excitement. "Are you saying there are oral traditions that relate to this specific tomb?" "Not just traditions, Doctor. Instructions, warnings, and most importantly, tests designed to determine whether those who seek entry understand the true purpose of what lies within." Khalil glanced back at the sealed entrance, where late afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen across the hieroglyphic inscriptions. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Khalil made his way to the workers' quarters, where he had been assigned a small room during his time at the dig site. The space was spartanly furnished with a narrow bed, a simple wooden chair, and a small table where he kept his few personal possessions. From beneath his pillow he withdrew a worn leather pouch that contained his most precious inheritance, his grandfather's journal. Unlike the academic books that filled Dr. Whitfield's library, this journal was written in Arabic script, interwoven with ancient Egyptian symbols, a personal notation system that his grandfather had developed to record the oral traditions in written form for the first time in centuries. The journal contained not just stories, but detailed drawings of symbols, architectural plans, and, most importantly, the spiritual principles that guided how the ancients approached their sacred spaces. Khalil's grandfather had been illiterate in the modern sense, but he possessed a deep understanding of how meaning could be preserved and transmitted across generations through carefully structured narratives. As Khalil opened the journal and began reading his grandfather's account of Amenemhet's tomb, the outside world faded away. The story unfolded in his mind like a vivid dream, taking him back 3,000 years to a time when Egypt was transforming from one era to another, when old certainties were crumbling and new realities were emerging. According to the tradition, Amenemhet had been chosen by the high priests to preserve the most essential knowledge of the old ways, but rather than simply hiding scrolls or artifacts, he had devised a more sophisticated approach. His tomb was designed as a teaching tool, a puzzle that could only be solved by someone who understood not just the mechanics of ancient Egyptian construction, but the spiritual and philosophical principles that had guided their civilization. The entrance mechanism wasn't hidden in the traditional sense. Instead, it required a sequence of actions that demonstrated the seeker's understanding of key concepts: balance, transformation, respect for the dead, and most crucially, the relationship between knowledge and responsibility. The hieroglyphs weren't instructions in the conventional sense, but rather a test of character and wisdom. Khalil spent the evening reviewing his grandfather's notes, tracing the symbols with his finger as he had done countless times as a child, learning the stories. Each symbol carried multiple layers of meaning, each arrangement suggested different interpretations, and the overall composition told a story that was both historical narrative and spiritual teaching. As night fell over the dig site, Khalil could see lights still burning in Dr. Whitfield's much larger accommodation, where the archaeologist was undoubtedly reviewing his own research and preparing for what he expected to be an amusing conclusion to the day's entertainment. The British doctor had built his career on a foundation of academic credentials and institutional support, but he had never learned to listen to the land itself, or to the people who had lived on it for countless generations. In the darkness, Khalil made his way back to the tomb entrance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Security was minimal at this site, trusting that the sealed chamber itself was protection enough against casual theft. Standing before the ancient inscriptions, he placed his hands on the stone and closed his eyes, allowing his grandfather's words to flow through his consciousness. The story of Amenemhet began with the priest's concern that essential knowledge was being lost as political upheaval swept through Egypt. Wars, invasions, and the rise of new dynasties had disrupted the careful transmission of wisdom that had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia. Libraries burned, temples were destroyed, and the masters who carried traditional knowledge in their memories were scattered or killed. Faced with this crisis, Amenemhet had conceived a bold plan. Rather than trying to preserve knowledge in the traditional ways that had proven vulnerable to political chaos, he would create a different kind of repository. His tomb would serve as both his final resting place and a vault of wisdom, but access would be granted only to those who demonstrated genuine understanding of the principles that made such knowledge valuable. The entrance mechanism he designed was elegant in its simplicity and profound in its implications. It required the seeker to perform a series of actions that showed respect for the dead, understanding of ancient Egyptian cosmology, and most importantly, awareness that knowledge without wisdom could be dangerous. The test wasn't about intelligence or education in the modern sense, but about character and spiritual maturity. As Khalil stood in the darkness, running his hands over the inscriptions that had puzzled modern scholars for months, he could feel his grandfather's presence guiding his understanding. The symbols weren't meant to be read like a book, but rather experienced like a conversation with the ancient priest who had designed them. The night air carried the sounds of the desert, the subtle shifts and movements that spoke of life adapting to harsh conditions, of survival requiring both strength and flexibility. These same qualities, Khalil realized, were what Amenemhet had been looking for in those who might someday seek access to his preserved wisdom. When dawn broke over the dig site, Khalil was already waiting beside the tomb entrance. He had spent the pre-dawn hours in meditation and prayer, following the traditional preparations that his grandfather's journal recommended for approaching sacred spaces. Unlike Drive, Whitfield's scientific methodology, this preparation focused on spiritual and emotional readiness rather than technical knowledge. As the camp began to stir with morning activity, word quickly spread that the challenge would be concluded that day. Workers gathered at a respectful distance, curious to see how the confrontation between their colleague and the foreign expert would resolve. Graduate students emerged from their tents with cameras and notebooks, ready to document what they expected to be an educational failure. Dr. Whitfield appeared just after sunrise, already dressed in his expedition clothes and carrying a cup of coffee. His confidence was evident in every gesture, the relaxed demeanor of someone who knew the outcome of the day's events was predetermined. Behind him came the donors and senior researchers, ready to witness the conclusion of what they viewed as an amusing interlude in their serious archaeological work. "Well, Hassan," Dr. Whitfield called out as he approached, "I trust you've spent the night preparing for disappointment. The tomb remains as sealed as it has been for 3 millennia, and it will remain so when the sun sets tonight." Khalil bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that drew snickers from some of the observers, who interpreted it as subservience rather than dignity. "Dr. Whitfield, I am ready to begin. But first, may I ask you to consider what you hope to find inside this tomb?" The question caught the archaeologist off guard. "What I hope to find?" "Evidence, artifacts, inscriptions that will advance our understanding of this historical period. What else would an archaeologist hope to find? And if you find such things, what will you do with them?" Khalil continued, his tone remaining respectful but probing deeper into assumptions that Dr. Whitfield had never examined. "We'll study them, catalog them, publish our findings in academic journals, perhaps display them in museums where they can educate the public about ancient Egyptian civilization." Dr. Whitfield's answer was automatic, the standard response that justified archaeological excavation in the modern era. Khalil nodded thoughtfully. "These are worthy goals, Doctor, but may I suggest that the builder of this tomb had different intentions? That perhaps he designed the entrance mechanism to test not just whether someone could open the chamber, but whether they should open it?" Dr. Sarah Chen felt a chill of recognition at Khalil's words. Her studies of oral traditions had revealed that ancient Egyptian priests often embedded ethical considerations into their sacred architecture, creating spaces that responded to the spiritual state and intentions of those who approached them. She had written papers on this concept, but none of her colleagues had taken the idea seriously. "Enough philosophy," Dr. Whitfield declared impatiently. "You've made your claim, Hassan. Now demonstrate your supposed expertise, or admit that you were mistaken." Khalil approached the tomb entrance and knelt before the inscribed stones. His movements were slow and deliberate, each gesture carrying the weight of generations of tradition. He began to speak in Arabic, his voice low but clear, reciting words that his grandfather had taught him decades earlier. The observers watched in fascination as Khalil's hands moved across the hieroglyphic inscriptions, not randomly but following patterns that seemed to emerge from deep understanding. Dr. Sarah Chen recognized some of the Arabic words he was speaking, prayers and invocations that were far older than Islam, remnants of ancient Egyptian spiritual practices that had survived in folk traditions. As Khalil continued his preparations, something extraordinary began to happen. The hieroglyphs seemed to respond to his touch, not physically changing but somehow becoming clearer, their meanings more apparent to those who watched. Dr. Chen found herself understanding symbols that had puzzled her for months, their significance suddenly obvious as Khalil's fingers traced their outlines. "This is ridiculous," Dr. Whitfield muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Something about the scene unfolding before the tomb was unsettling his assumptions about how ancient mechanisms functioned. His scientific training told him that stone couldn't respond to touch or prayer, yet he couldn't ignore the growing sense that forces beyond his understanding were at work. Khalil completed his preparatory rituals and stood facing the sealed entrance. According to his grandfather's journal, the final test required not just knowledge of the correct sequence, but genuine commitment to the responsibilities that came with accessing ancient wisdom. The tomb's builder had designed the mechanism to respond not to cleverness or determination, but to authentic understanding of why such knowledge needed to be preserved and protected. "Amenemheb," Khalil spoke to the ancient stones, his voice carrying the reverence of someone addressing a wise elder. "I come seeking not treasure or fame, but understanding. I offer myself as a bridge between your time and mine. a vessel for carrying your wisdom forward to those who can use it wisely. He pressed his palm against a specific hieroglyph, one that Dr. Whitfield's team had photographed and analyzed dozens of times without recognizing its significance. The symbol represented not a physical object or action, but a spiritual concept, the willingness to accept responsibility for knowledge gained. For a moment, nothing happened. The observers held their breath, Dr. Whitfield preparing to deliver his victory speech about the triumph of science over superstition. Then, with a sound like distant thunder, the massive stone blocks that had sealed the tomb for 3,000 years began to move. The movement wasn't mechanical in any way that modern engineering could explain. The stones seemed to flow like water, rearranging themselves according to principles that defied conventional understanding of physics. As the entrance opened, revealing a corridor that stretched into darkness beyond, a cool breeze emerged from the tomb's interior, carrying with it the faint scent of ancient incense and something else, something that seemed to whisper of secrets preserved across millennia. Dr. Whitfield stared in complete shock, his scientific worldview crumbling as he witnessed something that his education insisted was impossible. The donors gasped and reached for their cameras, capturing images of an event that would challenge everything they thought they knew about ancient Egyptian capabilities. Victoria Sterling, the steel heiress, felt tears streaming down her face as she witnessed what she could only describe as magic made manifest. This wasn't the sterile discovery of another archaeological artifact, but the living demonstration that the ancient world possessed knowledge and capabilities that modern civilization had lost or forgotten. Dr. Sarah Chen was already moving toward the entrance, her academic excitement overriding her caution. But Khalil raised his hand, stopping her approach. "Wait, Doctor. The tomb is open, but entry requires preparation. Amenemheb designed this space to teach, but those who enter without proper understanding risk more than physical danger." The open tomb represented the conclusion of part one of their story, but it was also the beginning of something far more profound. As Khalil stood before the ancient entrance he had unlocked through wisdom rather than force, everyone present understood that they were witnessing not just the opening of a sealed chamber, but the bridge between two worlds of knowledge separated by 3,000 years of time. The silence that followed the tomb's opening stretched across the dig site like the shadow of a great pyramid. Dr. Whitfield stood frozen, his mouth agape, staring at the ancient corridor that had materialized before them as if conjured from the desert itself. The massive stone blocks that had defied every modern attempt at entry now rested in perfect symmetry, creating an entrance that seemed to invite exploration while simultaneously commanding respect. Victoria Sterling was the first to break the stunned quiet. "How is this possible?" she whispered, her voice carrying the awe of someone witnessing something that challenged everything she believed about the world. The steel heiress had built her fortune on understanding how things worked, on the predictable behavior of materials and markets, but what she had just observed operated according to principles that her rational mind couldn't process. Khalil remained standing before the open tomb, his weathered hands still resting on the hieroglyphic inscriptions that had responded to his touch. The cool air flowing from the ancient chamber carried more than just the scent of preserved time. It brought with it a sense of presence, as if the spirit of Amenemheb himself was welcoming visitors after 3 millennia of patient waiting. "The stones moved like they were alive," Dr. Sarah Chen murmured, her archaeological training warring with the evidence of her own eyes. She had spent years studying ancient Egyptian construction techniques, but nothing in the academic literature had prepared her for witnessing architecture that seemed to respond to spiritual rather than mechanical forces. Dr. Whitfield finally found his voice, though it emerged as a croak rather than his usual confident tone. "There has to be a logical explanation. Hidden hydraulics, perhaps, or some kind of delayed mechanism triggered by pressure points we hadn't identified." Even as he spoke the words, he knew they sounded hollow. No ancient civilization possessed the technology to create what he had just witnessed, and modern engineering couldn't duplicate the seamless flow of massive stone blocks rearranging themselves without visible supports or mechanisms. "Dr. Whitfield," Khalil said gently, his tone carrying no trace of triumph or mockery despite the dramatic reversal of their positions, "would you like me to explain how this was accomplished, as we agreed?" The British archaeologist nodded mutely, his earlier arrogance replaced by the stunned expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had just been shattered. The donors and graduate students gathered closer, their cameras forgotten in the face of something that transcended mere documentation. Khalil gestured toward the hieroglyphic inscriptions that covered the tomb's entrance. These symbols tell the story of Amenemhet's greatest concern. He lived during a time when Egypt was changing rapidly, when the old ways of understanding the world were being lost or forgotten. He feared that future generations would possess the tools to access ancient knowledge without the wisdom to use it responsibly. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her academic mind grappling with implications that extended far beyond archaeology. "You're saying he designed this tomb as some kind of test?" "Not a test of intelligence or education," Khalil clarified, "but a test of character and intention. The entrance mechanism responds not to correct answers, but to correct understanding. It requires the seeker to demonstrate respect for the wisdom they hope to gain and commitment to using that wisdom for purposes that honor its source." Victoria Sterling felt a chill of recognition. In her business dealings, she had encountered many people who possessed knowledge without wisdom, who used information as a weapon rather than a tool for building something meaningful. The idea that ancient priests had grappled with the same concerns seemed both impossible and inevitable. "But how did you know?" Dr. Whitfield asked, his scientific training demanding some kind of rational explanation even as his eyes told him that rational explanations might be inadequate. "How could you understand something that teams of experts missed?" Khalil's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were deciding how much of his family's secrets to reveal. "My grandfather was a keeper of stories, Whitfield. Not the kind of stories that get written in books, but the living traditions that carry the deepest truths of a people. He learned from his grandfather, who learned from his, stretching back through generations to a time when the knowledge preserved in this tomb was part of daily life rather than ancient mystery." The implications of Khalil's words settled over the group like desert sand, slowly but inexorably changing the landscape of everything they thought they knew. Dr. Sarah Chen found herself reconsidering years of academic training that had taught her to prioritize written sources over oral traditions, to trust scholarly analysis over the wisdom of local communities. "These stories," she said carefully, "they contain specific information about this tomb?" "They contain something more valuable than specific information, Doctor. They contain understanding of the principles that guided how the ancients approached sacred knowledge. Amenemhet wasn't just a priest or a scribe. According to our traditions, he was a bridge builder, someone who understood that wisdom needed to be preserved not just in its content, but in the methods for accessing and applying it responsibly." Dr. Whitfield struggled to process this concept. His entire career had been built on the assumption that ancient peoples were primitive compared to modern civilization, that archaeological discoveries represented the triumph of contemporary scientific methods over historical ignorance. The idea that 3,000-year-old spiritual principles might be more sophisticated than 21st-century analytical techniques challenged everything he had built his identity upon. "If what you're saying is true," Victoria Sterling interjected, her business mind cutting through the philosophical implications to practical concerns, "then there are other sites, other tombs, that might require similar understanding to access." Khalil nodded slowly. "Egypt is full of places that appear to be sealed or empty to those who approach them with the wrong intentions or insufficient preparation. Many of the greatest treasures aren't hidden because they're valuable in the way that modern people understand value. They're protected because they contain knowledge that could be dangerous if misused." The weight of this revelation settled over the group like the desert sun, intense and unavoidable. Dr. Chen thought of all the archaeological sites she had visited, the sealed chambers and unexplored passages that had been dismissed as empty or inaccessible. How many of them might yield their secrets to someone who approached them with the proper understanding and intentions? "May we enter the tomb?" Dr. Whitfield asked, his earlier commanding tone replaced by something approaching humility. The dramatic reversal of their positions hadn't been lost on anyone present, but Khalil's gracious response to his victory suggested depths of character that the archaeologist was only beginning to appreciate. "We may enter," Khalil replied, "but only after proper preparation. Amenemhet designed this space to teach, but the lessons it contains aren't meant for casual curiosity. Those who enter without understanding the responsibility that comes with ancient knowledge risk more than physical danger." Dr. Sarah Chen felt a flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension. Her studies of oral traditions had hinted at concepts like this: the idea that sacred spaces required spiritual as well as intellectual preparation, but she had never encountered it as a practical reality rather than historical theory. "What kind of preparation?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine respect for Khalil's expertise. "First, we must understand why Amenemheb chose to preserve this particular knowledge and what he hoped future generations would do with it. Second, we must commit to approaching what we find inside with the same respect we would show to a living teacher. Third, we must accept that gaining access to ancient wisdom creates obligations to use that wisdom in service of something greater than personal advancement." Victoria Sterling found herself nodding, recognizing principles that echoed her own hard-learned understanding of how power and knowledge should be wielded. "How long does this preparation take?" "For some, a lifetime," Khalil replied with a slight smile. "For others who have already begun to understand these principles through their own experience, perhaps a few hours of meditation and discussion." Dr. Whitfield looked around at his team, his donors, and the assembled workers, suddenly aware that the simple challenge he had issued the previous day had evolved into something far more complex and significant. The open tomb represented not just a breakthrough in archaeological technique, but a doorway into ways of thinking about knowledge and responsibility that his education had never addressed. "I think," he said slowly, "that we should postpone entry until we can properly understand what Mr. Hassan is teaching us." The admission represented a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had defined the dig site since Dr. Whitfield's arrival. The British archaeologist who had publicly mocked a janitor less than 24 hours earlier was now deferring to that same man's expertise on matters that his academic training hadn't prepared him to handle. Khalil acknowledged this gracious response with a respectful nod. "Dr. Whitfield, your willingness to learn honors both you and the knowledge that Amenemheb sought to preserve. Shall we begin with the story of why he chose to create this tomb in the manner that he did?" As the group settled into a circle near the tomb's entrance, Khalil began to share the oral traditions that had been passed down through his family for generations. Unlike the dry academic presentations that typically characterized archaeological discussions, his storytelling brought the ancient world to life, painting vivid pictures of the challenges and choices that had shaped how knowledge was preserved and transmitted across millennia. "Amenemheb lived during what your historians call the First Intermediate Period," Khalil began, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of traditional storytelling. "It was a time of great upheaval, when the Old Kingdom had collapsed, and new forms of authority were emerging throughout Egypt. Libraries burned, temples were abandoned, and many of the masters who carried traditional wisdom in their memories were scattered or killed." Dr. Chen found herself taking notes, not just of the historical information, but of the way Khalil wove together facts and meanings in patterns that made ancient events feel immediate and relevant. This was a different kind of historical understanding than she had learned in graduate school, one that connected past and present through continuous threads of human experience, rather than treating ancient civilizations as exotic curiosities. "Amenemheb was a priest scribe who served in the Temple of Thoth at Hermopolis," Khalil continued. "But he was also what we might call today a systems thinker, someone who understood that preserving knowledge required more than just protecting scrolls or inscriptions. He recognized that wisdom could only survive if it was embedded in ways of thinking and being that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential truths." Victoria Sterling listened with growing fascination, recognizing parallels to her own experiences in business, where the most valuable insights often came not from data or analysis but from understanding the deeper patterns that connected seemingly unrelated events. "The problem Amenemheb faced," Khalil explained, "was how to preserve the most essential knowledge in a form that would survive political chaos, natural disasters, and the inevitable changes that time brings to all human institutions. Simply hiding scrolls or artifacts wouldn't be sufficient, because future generations might lack the context to understand what they found. But creating obvious repositories would make them targets for destruction during times of conflict." Dr. Whitfield found himself completely absorbed in the narrative, his earlier skepticism replaced by growing appreciation for the sophistication of ancient thinking about problems that modern institutions still struggled to solve. So he designed the tomb as a kind of time capsule that would only open for people who already understood the principles behind what was preserved inside? Exactly, Khalil confirmed. But more than that, He created a teaching system that would ensure anyone who gained access to the preserved knowledge would also understand the responsibilities that came with it. The tomb isn't just a repository of information, it's a school for wisdom, designed to transform those who enter it. Dr. Sarah Chen felt a chill of recognition as she understood the implications of what Khalil was describing. The entrance mechanism wasn't just a lock. It was the first lesson, teaching people that ancient knowledge requires different approaches than contemporary methods of investigation. And the second lesson, Khalil added with a meaningful look at Dr. Whitfield, is that true expertise often comes from unexpected sources. The builders of this tomb understood that wisdom doesn't always correlate with formal education or social status. They designed their tests to respond to character and understanding rather than credentials or authority. The pointed but gentle nature of this observation wasn't lost on anyone in the group. Dr. Whitfield had spent the previous day demonstrating exactly the kind of assumptions about expertise and authority that the ancient tomb builders had anticipated and planned to challenge. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Hassan," Dr. Whitfield said quietly, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "Not just for yesterday's behavior, but for months of treating you as invisible, while you worked at sites where your knowledge could have been invaluable." Khalil accepted this acknowledgement with grace. "Dr. Whitfield, you are not alone in making such assumptions. The modern world has created systems that often obscure, rather than reveal, where true wisdom resides. Part of what Amenemheb hoped to teach is that learning requires humility and openness to instruction from sources we might not expect." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Khalil continued sharing the stories and principles that would prepare them for entering the tomb. He spoke of the ancient Egyptian understanding of knowledge as a living force that required careful cultivation rather than aggressive extraction, of wisdom as something that grew through relationship and respect rather than domination and analysis. Victoria Sterling found herself thinking about her own relationship with knowledge and power, recognizing patterns in her business practices that paralleled what Khalil was describing. The most successful leaders she knew were those who understood that information without wisdom could be destructive, that true expertise required not just technical skills but emotional and spiritual maturity. Dr. Chen took extensive notes, but more importantly, she began to understand how her academic training had prepared her for only one kind of learning. The oral traditions that Khalil represented offered a different model, one based on relationship and trust rather than objective analysis, on transformation of the learner rather than mere accumulation of data. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Khalil stood and approached the tomb entrance once again. "I believe we are ready for the second lesson," he announced. "But remember, what we find inside will challenge us to grow, not just to know." The group followed him toward the opened corridor, each person carrying a different mixture of excitement and apprehension. Dr. Whitfield had experienced a complete transformation in his understanding of expertise and authority. Dr. Chen had discovered new dimensions to her academic discipline. Victoria Sterling had encountered principles that would reshape how she thought about knowledge and responsibility in her business empire. As they crossed the threshold into the ancient chamber, the cool air that flowed around them seemed to whisper of secrets preserved across millennia, of wisdom that had waited 3,000 years for people who could approach it with the proper understanding and intentions. The tomb's interior glowed with a soft light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, revealing passages and chambers that extended far deeper into the earth than any surface examination had suggested. Khalil paused just inside the entrance, his hand resting on an inscription that none of the others could read. "Amenemheb welcomes us," he said softly. "But he also reminds us that what we learn here creates obligations that will extend far beyond this moment." The walls around them were covered with hieroglyphs and paintings that seemed to shift and flow in the strange light, telling stories that connected ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges in ways that made the past feel vibrantly alive. Dr. Chen realized that she was experiencing history not as a subject to be studied, but as a living conversation between past and present, between teachers who had faced eternal human challenges and students who were still grappling with the same fundamental questions. As they moved deeper into the tomb, following corridors that seemed to guide their steps rather than simply contain them, each member of the group began to understand that they had entered more than just an ancient burial chamber. They had crossed into a space where time worked differently, where learning happened not through analysis but through transformation, where the greatest treasures weren't objects to be collected but insights to be lived. Dr. Whitfield found himself thinking about all the sites he had excavated, all the artifacts he had cataloged and theories he had published, wondering how many opportunities for deeper understanding he had missed because he approached ancient wisdom with contemporary assumptions about how knowledge worked. Victoria Sterling walked in contemplative silence, recognizing that her encounter with Khalil and the tomb had challenged not just her understanding of archaeology, but her fundamental assumptions about how wisdom was transmitted and preserved in human communities. Dr. Sarah Chen felt as if years of academic training were being gently deconstructed and rebuilt along different lines, her scholarly mind expanding to accommodate ways of knowing that her education had never acknowledged as valid or valuable. And Khalil moved through the ancient spaces like someone returning home after a long journey, his grandfather's stories guiding their steps through chambers that had been designed to teach rather than simply impress, to transform rather than merely inform. The tomb they had entered was revealing itself to be far more than a repository of ancient artifacts. It was a bridge between worlds of understanding, a place where the wisdom of the past could meet the challenges of the present, where knowledge could be transformed into wisdom through the kind of learning that changed not just what people knew but who they were. As they reached the tomb's central chamber, where Amenemhet's sarcophagus rested surrounded by inscriptions that seemed to glow with their own inner light, Khalil turned to address his companions. "The final lesson," he said, "is that the greatest treasures aren't meant to be possessed but to be shared. What we learn here becomes part of who we are, and through us, part of what we can offer to the world." The transformation that had begun with a simple challenge about opening a sealed tomb was revealing itself to be something far more profound, a fundamental shift in how knowledge and wisdom were understood, preserved, and transmitted from one generation to the next. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.